Joining me on Up in the Valley is Dr. Victor Villanueva. He's a professor of English and Rhetoric at Washington State University at Pullman. His area of interest is the connection between language and racism. Victor, thanks for joining me.
Anytime.
Place to begin, you write a lot about the new racism, and take us through how's the new racism different from the old racism?
Well, probably the biggest difference between the old racism was it was in your face. And now it is the thing we don't talk about. It's become the new taboo. We just don't mention racism anymore. And yet, the attitudes, the structural frameworks that were at play that made racism continue to work out. So it's a way in which we don't acknowledge the racism that exists that makes the racism new.
So is it, I mean, in a way that almost seems worse if you're doing the same practices and burying them.
Well, yeah, worse in some sense. I mean, that, you know, I was in Kansas City, Missouri at one time, and somebody was very vocally racist and looked at me in the face and said, well, at least I ain't no hypocrite. And I realized then that I really wanted the hypocrisy. It made me feel better. So in some sense, yes, if we don't address it, it's not going to go away, and that makes it more of a problem. And in the other sense, at least we can walk around and not have somebody spit in our face, you know. So,
but in the old days, we used to have the sort of the scientific basis of racism. We had the phrenologists who would study the bumps on the head, and we had these, you know, like biological reasons that people could, you know, subscribe to. But now it seems to me that you're interested in how language is something that can be used to further racism.
Well, yeah, because the biological explanations no longer apply. I mean, they can't be sustained. And so part of what's happened in that transition from that old biological explanation to the new thing is that we added the new word, ethnicity. Ethnicity means something like you're still a victim of racism, but we can't peg your color, right? And since we can't buy these biological explanations anymore, we don't even talk about race anymore. I mean, the conversation is less now about race than about the effects, about racism, and that is carried through the language. So
we live in this age where we're all colorblind, but then again, we're not colorblind at all.
Yeah,
we're just pretending we are.
Yeah, colorblind's a lie. No, I say it's a lie, but it's not a malicious lie. I think that what we talk about with colorblind is a wish, and that is the wish that we could all just get along, Rodney King, that we could all just get along and go about our business without acknowledging the race, except that we know that the racism is still there. So what that ends up being, the colorblind, is a lie in effect, even if not an intent. Yeah.
So what do you say then to the people who say things like, well, you know, I don't have any slaves, it doesn't affect me, it was all back then?
Yeah, well, I'm always very proud of them. I mean, students will do that always. I never killed an Indian, I never owned a slave. I say, I'm very proud of you. But the problem with that, of course, is that it is relegating racism to individual acts, and it's less a matter of individual acts, because I do believe, sincerely, that folks would rather there weren't racism, but we're not addressing the structural problems that continue to exist. If anything, there is now the backlash, which folks are calling reverse discrimination, which of course isn't. I mean, it's still going forward. It's just that it's an acknowledgement that racism can affect everyone, including the majority.
So when you mention structural issues, how about some examples?
Well, structural racism, the ways in which it plays out. In my business, Latinos who are college professors are 3%. 3% of all college professors are Latino, yet we're 16% of the population. To argue the case that that's a matter of laziness or some sort of cultural pathology that says that Latinos don't value higher education are themselves these examples of the racism at play. So there are matters of access, there's questions of poverty. We know that the majority of folks who live in poverty are folks of color, and with that mentality of individualism, then it's easy to ignore the structural problems, and just point to the prisons. Is that really a series of cultural pathologies that has the majority of the people in the prisons be black and Latino? Likely not. I mean, just a throw of the dice, just by a throw of the dice, it's not tenable that great a number would be that malicious and pathological.
So do you see then as, you know, Used to be white juries were really handy at convicting the blacks and Latino criminals with far greater penalties. But do you see any change then as, say, juries have become more racially mixed?
Well, you know, and that's part of what this new racism is about, because if we buy into the dominant ideology of our society, which is individualism, then we can have the folks of color blaming the individual who's done this individual act and never quite make a leap into the ways in which these patterns are suggesting something very old and pervasive.
So think about New Orleans. I mean, 1 year after the hurricane in New Orleans, then the easy way out is to say these thousands of people, we can blame them individually. They didn't get on the bus.
Yeah,
they could have left and they didn't.
Yeah, well, and one of those hints at racism is a friend of mine's sister who said that, well, those people didn't know what to do. There's first those people, that's always a clue. Those people didn't know, besides their fourth generation welfare.
Wow.
Yeah, it was just said off the top.
So, in other words, we can't refer to color anymore, but we could say, well, they're fourth generation welfare, there's something cultural, but it's not me, it's them.
Yes, of course.
Because then there's no structural overview.
It's them as a collection of individuals also who are lazy and all of the other old-fashioned tropes.
So how much success do you have as you travel around the country and give talks trying to get people into this?
Well, you know, a teacher is always a utopian, huh? I mean, why teach if you don't believe in the utopian hope? I don't know that I have any real effect, but at least something is said, some people will hear, and maybe there's a ripple effect. And all I can really be sure about is that nothing will change if it remains silent.
We need to take a quick break, and when I want to come back, I want to ask you about your book, Bootstraps. I know that came out a few years ago, and I have another couple questions that I want to get into, asking about how racism, you know, is still here and still evolving.
Gotcha,
So
sir.
thanks. We'll be right back.